Rain in Seoul has a sound all its own. It's not a gentle tap, not a whisper. It's a hiss, a steady, relentless sigh against a glass of city that never truly sleeps. It washes the grime from the alleys and polishes the asphalt until the streets gleam like black mirrors, reflecting a world that is always moving, always hungry. It's a sound of cleansing and a sound of sorrow. But inside these walls, the world holds its breath. The air doesn't smell like rain. It smells of antiseptic, of bleach, and the faint, metallic tang of blood that no amount of cleaning can ever truly erase. Here, the only rhythm is a cold, electric drone of fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting long, lonely shadows on the polished linoleum floors. This is a world of night shift, a purgatory of quiet suffering where time stretches and thins, measured only by the rhythmic beep of a distant heart monitor or the soft, squeaking protest of rubber-soled shoes against the floor. For Elena Price, this world was more familiar than her own small apartment, a place she rarely saw in the daylight. A trauma nurse, an entire ocean away from the sun-scorched earth she called home, she had learned the universal language of pain, the silent dialect of a body giving up. She had stitched wounds that told lurid stories of bar fights and car crashes, of lives unraveling in a single, careless, irrevocable moment. She was a mechanic of the human body, an architect of second chances. But tonight was different. Tonight, a story had been wheeled into her ward that no one wanted to read aloud. Tonight, there was Room 9. The chart was an insult to paperwork, a single, sterile page that offered more questions than answers. Most of the fields were blank or worse, filled with stark, black lines of redaction. No name, no age, no medical history, just a room number, a diagnosis, and a warning that chilled the air around it. Gunshot wound, high priority, police supervision. A senior nurse, Mrs. Kim, a woman whose face was a roadmap of 1,000 night shifts, leaned in close to Elena, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. 2 officers are outside his door, plainclothes detectives. They said he's not to be left alone, not for a single second. She paused, her eyes dark with gravity Elena had rarely seen. They looked nervous. Elena, cops like that don't get nervous unless they're guarding a demon. Elena's instinct, the one honed by years of seeing the worst of humanity wheeled through the emergency room doors, screamed at her. It was a cold, sharp feeling that coiled in her gut, a primal warning system that said, this is not a victim. This is the cause. This is something else entirely. But her conscience, the stubborn, bleeding heart that pulled her across the world to mend things that were broken, spoke louder. He was her patient. In this sterile, white world, under these humming fluorescent lights, that was the only truth that mattered. His sins were not her jurisdiction. His wounds were. She pushed the door to Room 9 open, and the atmosphere shifted. The air inside felt heavy, compressed, charged with a tension that was almost physical. The rhythmic, steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound, a fragile metronome counting out the seconds of a life in the balance. The room was dim, the blinds drawn against the city's bruised, violet glow, leaving the space in a geography of deep shadows and the weak, technical light from a medical equipment. He was a landscape of shadows and bandages, laid out on the stark white sheets. He was less a man and more an effigy of violence. His chest was a tight, careful construction of gauze and medical tape. One arm, laced with the intricate, flowing ink of a dragon tattoo that coiled from his wrist to his shoulder, was free, resting on the sheet like a piece of dark art. The other was shackled to the bed rail with a single, grim-looking handcuff. The metal glinted, cold and indifferent under the weak light. She moved with the practiced, unhurried calm of her profession, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the room's inherent violence. Her focus narrowed to the task at hand. Checking the foredrip, its clear fluid a lifeline descending from a bag, monitoring the green, jagged peaks of his vitals on the screen. His breathing was shallow, a quiet, laborious rasp in the charged silence. She assumed he was unconscious, lost in the merciful fog of morphine. Just another broken body delivered by the city's brutal, unforgiving night. Then his eyes opened. They weren't the eyes she was used to seeing, not dull with medication, or hazy with pain. They were dark, like chips of obsidian, and terrifyingly sharp. And they were utterly, completely aware. They fixed on her, not with the desperation of a patient, but with the unnerving, predatory stillness of an animal watching from shadows. His gaze traveled from her face down to the gentle, efficient way her hands checked the drip, and then back up again. It was a look that wasn't just seeing her. It was cataloging her, analyzing her, measuring her. His voice, when it came, was a dry, broken whisper, the sound of stones scraping together in the dark. It tore through the room's quiet hum. "Don't," he rasped, his throat raw, each word an effort. "Don't let them kill me before morning." Elena froze, her hand hovering over the floor line. The sterile air of the room suddenly felt thick, electric, impossible to breathe. The request hung between them, a thing of weight and danger. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a command wrapped in the guise of a prayer. Her training, her very nature, screamed at her to soothe him, to offer the empty, professional platitudes about safety and doctors and the sterile sanctity of the hospital. But the look in his eyes held no room for such lies. He knew what he was. He knew what kind of men waited for him outside this room, and he was testing her. She didn't answer with words. She simply met his gaze, held it for a single, suspended heartbeat, and then turned to replace the saline bag. An unspoken contract passed between them in that silence. "I am your nurse. You are my patient. For tonight, that is the only law in this room, the only truth that matters." Through the long, deep hours of night, as the rain beat its lonely, percussive rhythm against the glass, she worked. A silent, focused dance of care and procedure. She cleaned the wound, a brutal, dark flower blooming on his chest. She administered morphine for a pain he never once acknowledged with a grimace or a groan, and she watched the steady, jagged line of his heartbeat on the monitor, a fragile thread she was determined not to let snap. And all the while, he watched her. His silence was a tangible thing, a weight, a presence that filled every corner of the room. He tracked her every move, every soft footstep on the linoleum, every careful adjustment of his pillow. It was the most intimate, unnerving interrogation she had ever endured. She could feel his gaze on her back as she mixed a solution, on her hands as she checked his pulse. He was a prisoner in his own body, yet in that room he was the one in control. She learned his name later, not from him, but from hushed, fearful whispers of two passing detectives in the hall who thought she was out of earshot. Ryu Kong, head of the Golden Dragon Syndicate, a name spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence in the city's dark underbelly. A monster, they called him, a king in a kingdom of shadows. But in the dim, isolated world of Room 9, as the storm raged outside, Elena saw only a man with a hole in his chest, tethered to life by a thin plastic tube and the steady work of her hands. The first pale, exhausted light of dawn began to bleed into the sky, turning the bruise purple to a soft, forgiving gray. The rain had finally stopped. Elena was finishing her notes, the pen scratching quietly in the newfound stillness, when the door opened. It wasn't the gentle click of a nurse entering, but the sharp, metallic turn of a key in a lock. Two detectives entered, their faces grim, their cheap suits rumpled from a long night. They didn't look at her. Their focus was entirely on him. One of them produced a key and, with a final, decisive click, unlocked the handcuff. There were no words, no thank yous, no acknowledgement of the life she had guarded through the night. They were simply there to collect their property. When she turned back from the sink where she was washing her hands, the room was empty. He was gone. The bed was a tangle of sheets, still holding the faint warmth of his body. The machines he'd been tethered to were silent. The only evidence he had ever been there was a single, dark drop of his blood on the white linoleum floor, stark and vivid, a final, silent full stop to a chapter she never should have opened. The ghost of his presence lingered, a chill in the air that the morning sun couldn't quite burn away. Would you heal a man everyone else calls a monster? Subscribe, because this is just the beginning. A week passed, then two. The memory of Room 9 and the man with obsidian eyes began to fade, blurring into the endless, exhausting montage of broken bones and failing hearts that made up her life. She told herself he was just another patient. Another ghost story to be filed away in the crowded archives of her mind. The city was a sprawling, anonymous beast of millions. Their worlds were never meant to collide again. It was a statistical impossibility. She was wrong. It was waiting for her at the corner of her street on a crisp autumn evening, when the air smelled of ginkgo leaves and roasting chestnuts. A sleek, black sedan, its windows tinted to an impenetrable, arrogant darkness. It didn't belong here, among the humble noodle shops and the brightly lit corner markets. It sat there like a panther in a field of doves, silent, patient, and predatory. Her steps faltered. A cold knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach. The back door opened with a soft, expensive, nearly inaudible click. And there he was. He was sitting inside, bathed in the soft, ambient light of the car's interior. He was no longer a patient, a broken thing on white sheets. He was wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit, the fabric shimmering under the street lights. His hair was immaculate, and the only sign of his near-fatal injury was a slight, almost imperceptible stiffness in his posture. A slow, knowing smirk played on his lips. He looked powerful. The raw, contained danger she had sensed in the hospital room was now refined, polished, and aimed directly at her. He wasn't dying anymore. He was alive, and he was waiting for her. "You saved me," he said. His voice was no longer a broken whisper, but a low, smooth baritone that seemed to wrap around the evening air, silencing the city's ambient noise. "That makes us connected." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against a cage. She took a step back, her hand clutching the strap of her bag. "I was doing my job." "Some people's jobs are more important than others," he replied, his gaze unwavering. He gestured to the empty leather seat beside him. A slim, black briefcase sat on it, with a flick of his wrist. He opened it. It was filled with cash. Neat, tight stacks of currency that could erase her student loans, pay her rent for years, and send her home on the next flight. A token of my gratitude. She looked at the money, a small fortune that represented an easy way out of her quiet struggles. Then she looked back at his face, at the smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. The offer felt like an insult, a cold transaction designed to close the books on what had passed between them in that room, to sanitize it, to erase the strange intimacy of it. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice firmer than she felt, cutting through the cool night air. "You can't buy forgiveness." His smirk widened, and a flicker of something, amusement, respect, danger, danced in his dark eyes. Who said anything about forgiveness? He closed the briefcase with a soft, final snap. The car door shut, sealing him back inside his world of tinted glass and quiet luxury. He didn't press her. The car just pulled away from the curb, gliding silently into the river of traffic, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, her heart pounding with a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to name. He didn't need to press her. The connection he spoke of was not something he intended to ask for. He intended to forge it, whether she wanted it or not. He began to appear at the edges of her life, a shadow in her periphery. She'd exit the hospital after a grueling 12-hour shift, and the black sedan would be parked across the street a silent, unmoving fixture. He'd be standing at the far end of the bus stop, not speaking, not looking at her directly, just watching, a silent sentinel in the bustling urban landscape. He never approached. He never threatened. He was just there, a constant, unnerving presence that served as a quiet reminder that his world and hers had bled into one another, and the stain was permanent. It was a quiet siege on her solitude, a slow, methodical chipping away at the walls she had built around her life. And slowly, terrifyingly, it began to work. The initial fear started to curdle into something else, something more complex and dangerous. A strange, magnetic curiosity, an unwelcome sense of being seen. One night, as a cold, sharp autumn wind swept through the near-empty hospital parking lot, he was there, leaning against the polished hood of his car. This time, he didn't just watch. As she approached, he stepped directly into her path. He didn't say hello. He simply looked at her for a long moment, then reached up and undid the top two buttons of his crisp, white shirt. With a slow, deliberate movement, he pulled the fine fabric aside. There, against the pale skin of his chest, just above his heart, was the scar. A thin silver line, perfectly stitched, almost invisible against his skin. Her work, a permanent mark she had left on him. "Every time it aches," he said, his voice low and intimate, a sound meant only for her in the vast, empty lot. "I remember your hands." His fingers gently, almost reverently, traced the line of the scar. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The gesture was so unexpected, so vulnerable, so raw, it disarmed her completely. In that moment, he wasn't the menacing crime lord. He was a man from Room 9, the man whose life she had held in her hands. And in that moment, the wall she had so carefully, so desperately built between them, crumbled into dust. They started talking, not about what he did or the world of violence he commanded, but about the quiet spaces in between. They stood in the cold, their breath foggy in the air, and shared small, dangerous pieces of honesty. She spoke of her loneliness, of the profound ache of being a stranger in a land that was not her own, of the constant, crushing weight of being the one who always had to fix everything for everyone else. He spoke of pain, not the physical kind, which he dismissed with a wave of his hand, but the deeper, colder kind that settled in the bones. The pain that came from a world built on violence and betrayal, where trust was a currency more valuable than gold, and just as rare. "You fix people," he said one night, his eyes holding hers in the dim orange glow of a streetlight. "Even the ones you shouldn't." Elena looked away from his intense gaze, toward the distant, glittering, indifferent lights of the city, a city that held both of them captive in very different ways. "Maybe," she replied, her voice barely a whisper against the wind. "Maybe that's my sin." The shift was subtle at first, a change in pressure, a slow tightening of the atmosphere around her. It was so subtle, she almost convinced herself she was imagining it. It began with the cameras. One morning she noticed a small, black, unobtrusive dome in the corner of the ceiling in her building's hallway. A week later, another appeared in the corner of her own living room. When she confronted him, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and outrage, Ryu was utterly unshaken. He stood on her doorstep, holding a bag of fresh groceries he brought, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for a crime lord to deliver produce. "There for your safety," he said, his tone calm, reasonable, leaving no room for argument. "This city at his teeth. I just want to make sure they don't bite you." But it wasn't the city she was beginning to fear. Next came the bodyguards. Two silent, imposing men in dark suits who would be waiting for her in a nondescript car after her shift. At first, he framed it as a favor. "It's late, let my men drive you." Soon, it was no longer a question. They were always there, walking her to her door, their presence silent, imposing barrier between her and the world. "The streets aren't safe for someone like you," he told her one evening, his hand gently brushing a stray braid from her face. "Someone like me?" she challenged, a spark of her old, fierce independence flaring in her eyes. His eyes darkened, his thumb stroking her cheek with a tenderness that sent a shiver down her spine and silenced her protest. "Someone I'd rather die than lose." The line hung between them. It was a confession, a promise, and a threat, all at once. Her freedom began to erode in small, imperceptible increments. Little liberties she had taken for granted were replaced by a suffocating protection. The late-night walks she loved, where she would lose herself in the city's anonymous embrace, were now escorted tours. The quiet solitude of her life was gone, replaced by the constant, low-level hum of his surveillance. It was a cage, but it was a cage padded with the softest velvet, gilded with the illusion of love and care. He started visiting her at the hospital. Late at night, when the halls were quiet and the ghosts of the day had retreated, he would appear in the doorway of the staff break room, a shadow in a designer coat, and the world would seem to shrink to just the two of them. He'd bring her coffee, the expensive kind, and they would talk for hours. "You're mine to protect," he'd whisper, his fingers circling her wrist. His touch was always gentle, too gentle. The terrifying, intoxicating contrast between the stories she heard about him, the man of blood and casual violence, and the soft, careful way he held her hand, was a drug. It made her feel special, chosen, the only person in the world who could touch the monster and find the man beneath. She was becoming addicted to this private version of him, the one no one else was allowed to see. She was falling for him. Or maybe she was just falling. The attack was fast, brutal, and terrifyingly real. She was leaving work, walking down a side street she walked 1,000 times before. It was dark, slick with a recent rain. Two figures emerged from a narrow alley, blocking her path. Their faces were hard, their movements practiced, their intentions clearly hostile. A hand clamped over her mouth, stifling her scream. The cold, unforgiving press of steel against her back. They wanted her purse, her phone, but there was a viciousness to it, a cruel energy that felt personal. She fought, adrenaline and fear screaming through her veins, but she was overpowered, slammed against the wet brick of the wall. Just as a wave of true, soul-deep panic began to swallow her, there was a blur of motion from the end of the street. Ryu. He moved with a speed and a lethal grace that stole her breath. It wasn't a fight. It was a dismantling. The sounds were sickeningly efficient. The sharp crack of bone, a choked gasp of pain, the dull thud of a body hitting the pavement. Within seconds, the two men were on the ground, broken and still, and Ryu was standing over them, his chest heaving, his face a mass of cold, controlled fury. He turned to her, his eyes wild, feral. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against him in an embrace that was both fierce and desperate. She was trembling uncontrollably, tears of fear and relief streaming down her face, soaking the front of his expensive coat. "You're safe now," he murmured into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I've got you. You're safe." He tilted her chin up, his gaze searching hers, his thumbs wiping away her tears. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was desperate, possessive, hungry. A kiss born not of passion, but fear and ownership. It was a brand, a claim. Elena, still shaking, her mind reeling, kissed him back, clinging to him as if he were the only solid thing in the world that had just tried to tear her apart. She melted into him, into the illusion of safety he offered. She didn't know, not yet, that the storm she was running from was him, that he had become her cage, and he had just rattled the bars to remind her why she should never, ever think to fly away. When protection becomes control, where does love end? Common if you've ever been torn between fear and desire. The truth, when it comes, is never a shout. It's a whisper, a crack in the facade. It was a careless word she overheard, a fragment of a conversation between two of his men in the hallway outside the penthouse. One was complaining to the other about a job, his voice low and resentful. A bit of street theater, he grumbled. Scare the nurse, play the hero, all for a bonus that barely covers drinks. The word snagged in her mind. Street theater. She pieced it together in the cold, silent hours of the morning, while Ryu slept peacefully beside her, his arm draped possessively over her waist. The attack. The impossible, perfect timing of his rescue. The attackers, their tattoos, she replayed the memory, the image suddenly sharp and clear. They were from a minor crew, one that owed allegiance and fear to the Golden Dragon Syndicate. To Ryu, the realization was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. The entire event, her terror, his heroism, their first kiss, it was all performance. A perfectly staged, flawlessly executed piece of theater designed for an audience of one. Her. She confronted him in the vast, sunlit living room. She stood before him, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible, yet it seemed to shake the very glass of the towering windows. "It was you," she said. "The men in the alley. They worked for you." Ryu didn't flinch. He stood before the panoramic view of the city, a king in his castle, and he didn't deny it. The absence of a lie was more damning than any confession. It was an admission of guilt. "You wanted me scared," she continued, a single, hot tear tracing a path down her cheek. "You wanted me terrified, scared enough to stay, scared enough to believe that I needed you to survive in this world you dragged me into." He finally turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw not a protector, but a master strategist. His expression was grim, pained, but resolute, the face of a man who believes in the righteousness of his own terrible deeds. "I can't lose you," he said, his voice raw with an emotion she now understood was not love, but obsession. "You don't understand what my world takes from people. The moment my enemies know you're my weakness, you become a target. I made you a target by being with you, so I had to be the one to shield you from a threat I created." Her tears fell freely now, hot and bitter with the taste of betrayal. "You didn't save me, Ryu," she choked out, the words tearing from her throat. "You didn't shield me. You put me in a cage and called it a castle. You replaced my freedom with yours." She walked past him, grabbing her coat from the chair where she'd left it. He didn't try to stop her. He just stood there, a statue carved from regret, and watched the best part of his world walk out the door. She left. She didn't pack a bag, didn't leave a note. She just walked out of the penthouse, out of the gilded cage, and disappeared into labyrinthine alleys of Seoul, the city that had once felt like a new beginning, and now felt like a prison from which she had just escaped. Without her, Ryu spiraled. The quiet, iron-fisted control that had defined him fractured and shattered. He became brutal, unhinged, a storm of violence without a center. His lieutenants feared him. His enemies, sensing a weakness, a crack in the armor of the great Ryu Kong, began to circle like sharks smelling blood in the water. But Ryu was no longer fighting for territory or power. He was fighting a war with himself, haunted by the ghost of a woman he had tried to own and, in doing so, had lost so completely. His obsession to find her made him reckless. And in his world, recklessness gets people killed. A rival gang, the Black Vipers, found her first. They had been watching, waiting. They saw her not as a person, but as the ultimate leverage, the key to breaking Ryu Kong. The final confrontation took place in a derelict warehouse by the docks, as a torrential rainstorm lashed the city. The air was thick with the smell of rust, decay, and the cold salt of the sea. It was a trap, and he had walked right into it. The world exploded into the deafening roar of gunfire and the terrified screams of men. Elena was in the middle of it all, a pawn in a brutal game she never asked to play. Ryu fought his way toward her through the chaos, a man possessed, his movements a blur of lethal precision, his only goal to get to her. He was almost there. He had cleared a path, his eyes locked on hers, a silent promise of rescue. That's when she saw it. A viper, hidden behind a stack of crates, taking careful aim at Ryu's unprotected back. In that split second, there was no thought. There was only instinct, the same deep, immutable instinct that had made her a nurse. The instinct to heal, to protect, to stand between a body and a bullet. She moved. The sound of the shot was deafening, echoing off the metal walls of the warehouse. But the pain was a quiet, shocking heat that spread through her abdomen. Stealing her breath, she stumbled forward, right into Ryu's arms, a small, surprised gasp escaping her lips. He caught her, his face a mass of confusion that instantly contorted into raw, absolute horror as he saw the dark, crimson flower blooming across the front of her simple shirt. "You said," she whispered, the world starting to blur at the edges, her hand coming up to touch his face, leaving a bloody smear on his cheek. "You said you'd die for me. I didn't think I'd go first." A sound tore from Ryu's throat, a raw, guttural cry of pure animal agony. He lifted her into his arms, her body suddenly limp, terrifyingly light. In that moment, he was no longer a crime boss, no longer a monster, no longer a king. He was just a man, sobbing, completely and utterly broken by the one person he tried to control, the one person who had just sacrificed everything for him. He ran with her out into the stormy night, a desperate, broken prayer on his lips, moving toward the wailing lament of distant sirens. This is where love bleeds into redemption. Hit like if you believe even the cruel can change. The world turns. The cycle completes itself. They were back where they started, in a hospital room, a space suspended between life and death. Only this time, the roles were cruelly, perfectly reversed. Elena was the one in the bed, pale and still, a fragile thing of tubes and bandages. And Ryu was the one in the visitor's chair, the helpless watcher. He looked hollowed out. The power, the arrogance, the dangerous certainty. It had all been stripped away, burned out of him, leaving only a vast, echoing landscape of exhaustion and grief. He never left her side. For weeks, as she hovered in the liminal, gray space between consciousness and darkness, he sat there. He didn't eat. He barely slept. He just watched the steady, fragile rhythm of the machines that were keeping her alive, as if his sheer force of will, his focused, desperate penance, could knit her back together. And in that quiet, sterile room, as he watched the woman he loved fight for her life because of him, he did the one thing no one, least of all himself, ever thought him capable of. He surrendered. He made a call to his lawyer, and then another and another. He began the slow, painful, and strategic process of dismantling his own empire. He gave the police key information, anonymous tips that led to arrests, to seizures, to the crumbling of the very foundations of the world he had built. He burned his kingdom to the ground, all on the non-negotiable condition that Elena's name was never mentioned, that she would be protected, truly protected, from the ashes. When she finally woke, the first thing she saw was him. His head was in his hands, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked up as if he'd felt her gaze, and the relief that flooded his features was so potent, so overwhelming. It was almost agonizing to witness. He took her hand, his touch hesitant, reverent, as if she were made of spun glass. "You once asked me if monsters can heal," he said, his voice quiet, broken, filled with the ghosts of his own actions. "I was wrong. The answer wasn't morphine or stitches. It wasn't about closing a wound. It was you." A weak, fragile smile touched her lips. Her voice was a bare whisper, but it was clear and it was steady. "Then prove it," she said. "Don't die trying to be good, Ryu. Don't seek punishment. Live it. Live a good life. That's harder." It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more difficult, more profound. It was a challenge, a path forward, a final, unexpected act of healing. He leaned down and kissed her hand, a long, lingering press of his lips to her skin. It was a kiss of fealty, of gratitude, of goodbye, a promise. Then he stood up, his back straight for the first time in weeks, and walked to the door. As he opened it, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, a mournful song drawing closer. He gave her one last look, his eyes filled with a universe of pain and gratitude, and then he was gone. He walked out of her life and into the back of a police car, leaving behind only the silence of the hospital room and the steady, reassuring beep of her heart monitor. Months passed. The seasons turned. Elena left the smog and the sorrow of the city, trading the noise and the neon for the quiet, breathing green of the countryside. She took a position at a small rural clinic, pouring herself back into the work that had always defined her. She was healing again, but this time she was healing herself. One afternoon, as the sun cast long, golden shadows across the rice paddies, a small, unmarked package arrived for her. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, there was no note, no name, no return address. There was just a delicate, shimmering silver chain, and on it, a single small pendant. It was shaped like a scar. She held the pendant in the palm of her hand, the cool metal warming against her skin. It gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol not of a wound, but of a connection that had been cauterized by sacrifice, a permanent mark. Every wound she had closed had opened another inside of her. But maybe, just maybe, that's how love truly heals, by hurting first. Should she forgive him when he returns? Or move on for good? Comment below and subscribe for episode 2, The Mafia's Second Life.